They didn't leave you. Not really. They began leaving long before the goodbye. In subtle pauses, in unspoken tension, in the way their eyes stopped meeting yours with softness. And deep down, you felt it. The slow, invisible unraveling. The warmth draining out of their voice. The presence turning into absence while they were still in the room. You asked yourself, what did I do wrong? Why did they change? Why do I feel abandoned by someone who once promised they'd stay? But what if the truth has nothing to do with you? What if they didn't abandon you because they never fully chose themselves to begin with? What if the version of them you fell for wasn't a mask worn to trick you, but a mask they wore to survive? You saw the real them and that terrified them. See, love has a strange way of uncovering what someone tries hardest to hide. And your presence, your sincerity wasn't just comforting to them. It was confronting. Because while you showed up with vulnerability, they showed up with rehearsed affection. While you led with depth, they responded with performance. Not because they were cruel, but because they were disconnected from their emotions, from their truth, from the abandoned version of themselves that they buried long ago. So, when you loved them, they felt exposed. They didn't run from you. They ran from the mirror you held up. And that mirror said, you can't fake presence here. You can't avoid your wounds here. You can't be half alive and still call this love. You were the reflection they couldn't face. This is the part no one talks about. That some people don't leave because they stopped loving you. They leave because they can't handle being loved by you. Because your love was sincere, unfiltered, uncompromising in its honesty. And to someone who has spent their life hiding from themselves, that kind of love feels dangerous. Not because it's harmful, but because it's real. And when someone has abandoned their own authenticity, real love feels unbearable. They were already gone long before the ending. Think back. There were moments, subtle but sharp, where you felt them pull away, where their body was there, but their spirit wasn't. And you blamed yourself. Maybe you tried harder. Maybe you shrank your needs. Maybe you told yourself, if I just love them better, they'll come back. But they were never fully here. Not because you weren't enough, but because they were never enough for themselves. They were surviving, performing, pleasing, avoiding. And love, true love, the kind that invites presence, was more than their nervous system could hold. So they withdrew, slowly, silently, until all you were left with was the echo of what almost was. The truth beneath the pain. You didn't lose them. They lost access to you the moment they stopped showing up for themselves. Your love did not scare them because it was flawed. It scared them because it was too whole. There's something haunting about being left by someone who never truly showed up to begin with. But the deeper truth, the one we don't always see through our grief, is this. They didn't betray you because of who you are. They betrayed themselves long before they ever met you. What you experienced wasn't personal. It was patterned, predictable. If you could see into their hidden history, and most of that history is written in one silent, unconscious act, self-abandonment. What is self-abandonment? It's not always obvious. It doesn't scream or slam doors. It whispers, it numbs, it avoids. Self-abandonment is when someone suppresses who they are to survive environments that never made room for their authenticity. It's when they were punished for being emotional, so they became emotionally unavailable. They were praised for people-pleasing, so they overextended to feel loved. They were never taught boundaries, so they now mistake enmeshment for connection. They were rejected when they were real, so they learned to perform. You weren't dating a villain. You were dating a survivor, someone who created a false self to earn approval. Someone who buried their needs because they were never met. Someone who mistook peace for boredom because their childhood taught them chaos was love. And when you came along clear, steady, open, they couldn't meet you there. Not because they didn't want to, but because they didn't know how. Jung, the shadow, and why they ran. Carl Jung called it the shadow, the parts of ourselves we disown. The feelings, truths, and memories we exile into the unconscious because we were taught they were unacceptable. And the longer we run from these shadows, the harder it becomes to love authentically, because we're no longer operating from truth. We're performing a role. When someone abandons their truth long enough, they begin to fear real intimacy, not because they don't crave it, but because they've built an identity that depends on avoiding it. Real love threatens that identity because it requires presence. It requires vulnerability. It requires them to feel all the things they've worked so hard to suppress. And so, instead of leaning in, they pull away, they ghost, they sabotage, they disappear not just from you, but from themselves. Why self-abandoners can't sustain intimacy? Here's the paradox. They want love, but they're terrified of being seen. They crave closeness, but they've wired their nervous system to equate closeness with danger. They say all the right words, but their body language, their consistency, their emotional presence, they all whisper the opposite. Why? Because somewhere deep inside, they still believe they have to earn love through sacrifice, that their real self isn't enough, that if they're fully known, they'll be rejected. So instead, they offer a curated version of themselves. They say, here's the version of me I think you'll love. Please don't look behind the curtain. But real connection, real intimacy pulls back the curtain. And when that happens, panic sets in. The nervous system can't lie. The body always remembers what the mind tries to forget. So even if they convince themselves that they're ready for love, if they've never healed their inner landscape, their nervous system will rebel. They'll start feeling suffocated by normal emotional needs, pushing you away the moment you become emotionally invested, accusing you of being too much when you ask for clarity, creating distance to feel safe only to feel lonely once they do. This isn't love. This is trauma bonding with someone else's wounded inner child, and no amount of fixing them will ever make them stay if they haven't chosen to return to themselves first. When you love someone who's abandoned themselves, here's what it looks like. You'll sense them holding back, but they'll insist everything's fine. You'll feel lonely, even when you're together. You'll question yourself constantly. You'll begin shrinking your needs, softening your truths, walking on eggshells, just to maintain a connection with someone who's halfway out the door. But here's the truth you need to hear. You cannot love someone into self-awareness. You cannot heal their childhood. You cannot parent their emotional immaturity. You cannot become their oxygen without losing your breath. And you weren't put on this earth to become someone's life support system. You were meant to love, yes, but not at the cost of abandoning yourself. The emotional cost of staying. When you stay with someone who has abandoned themselves, you begin abandoning yourself too. You start justifying emotional neglect, confusing anxiety with passion, interpreting withdrawal as mystery, believing love must be earned, not received. You stop trusting your intuition. You start clinging instead of connecting. You begin tolerating behaviors you once said you never would. And all the while, you tell yourself, if I just love them more, they'll finally see me. But they can't even see themselves. Why this isn't your job to fix. It's tempting to believe that if you're patient enough, kind enough, devoted enough, they'll come around. But what you're really doing is hoping your love can replace their lack of self-awareness. And that's not love. That's emotional labor. That's spiritual exhaustion. That's the slow erosion of your soul in the name of loyalty. You were never meant to become someone else's redemption story. You were meant to be met, fully, clearly, equally. The healing starts when you stop over-functioning. The moment you step back, the illusion breaks. You realize you weren't too much, they were too disconnected. You weren't needy, you were undernourished. You weren't the chaser, you were simply someone who stayed too long in a place you weren't being seen. This clarity doesn't come easy, but it's the beginning of everything. Because when you stop confusing your love with responsibility, you start reclaiming your life. You start asking, what part of me thought I had to earn love through sacrifice? And that question leads you home. So, they didn't abandon you because you were unworthy. They abandoned you because that's what they do to themselves, to their truth, to anything that reflects what they're not ready to feel. The emotional fallout of being left, the ache of being left by someone you loved, isn't just about losing them. It's about the silent war that erupts inside you afterward. The questions that echo at 2 a.m., the moments where you sit in the stillness, trying to make sense of an ending that never gave you closure. And the worst part, they didn't storm out. They slipped away, little by little, in smiles that didn't reach their eyes, in conversations that began to feel like performances, in the way they started responding with fine, when they used to respond with presence. They didn't say I'm leaving, they just stopped arriving. Abandonment without explanation hurts deeper. You weren't just grieving the relationship, you were grieving your own confusion. You were grieving the you that tried so hard to hold it together, to read between the lines, to rationalize the shift that no one explained. You kept showing up, but they kept pulling further away. And every time they did, you tried harder, because that's what your nervous system was trained to do. Maybe as a child, you had to perform to feel loved. Maybe you had to earn warmth from people who were emotionally inconsistent. So, when they started pulling away, you didn't see it as a red flag. You saw it as a challenge, a familiar pattern, a test of worth. And so you doubled down. You texted first. You softened your tone. You gave them more understanding than they ever gave you honesty. Not because you were weak, but because you were programmed to stay loyal to people who were emotionally unavailable. Emotional starvation is a form of psychological abuse. Let's name something clearly. Being with someone who never truly meets you is its own kind of slow death. It's not explosive. It's not violent, but it's deeply wounding, because when your emotional needs are constantly ignored, you begin to question whether you're even allowed to have them. They never said, "You're too much," but their silence did. They never said, "Your feelings don't matter," but their inconsistency did. And over time, you began shrinking your joy, shrinking your vulnerability, shrinking your voice, until one day, you wake up in a relationship where you're completely alone, except for the constant fear that if you finally speak your truth, they'll walk away. This is how trauma bonds are formed. You know, it wasn't healthy. You felt it. Your intuition whispered warnings long before the fallout, but something kept you there. Something deeper than logic. Something rooted in emotional survival. It's called a trauma bond, and it forms when the person who hurts you is also the person who gives you just enough comfort to keep you hoping. Not enough to feel safe, just enough to stay addicted to the possibility. You become tethered to the highs and lows, to their breadcrumbs of affection, to the illusion that if you can just be perfect enough, they'll finally show up the way you need. This cycle isn't love, it's emotional roulette, and it leaves you drained, disoriented, disconnected from your own self-worth. The lies you start believing when someone withdraws from you emotionally. You start telling yourself stories just to make sense of the emptiness. You say, maybe I was too needy, maybe I expected too much, maybe I wasn't enough. But those aren't truths. They're trauma responses. They're the mental gymnastics we do when we love someone who doesn't know how to love us back. You weren't too much. You were asking for the bare minimum. Presence, truth, consistency, reciprocity. But when someone has abandoned themselves, even the bare minimum feels like pressure, like invasion, like a threat to their emotional numbness. So they project, they blame, they ghost, and you're left holding the grief, the guilt, and the pieces. The grief you carry isn't just about them. Here's the part that takes your breath away. What you're grieving isn't just the relationship. You're grieving the version of you who believed in them, the safety you thought you'd found, the imagined future that died without warning, the illusion of mutual love, and perhaps hardest of all, you're grieving the part of yourself that overfunctioned, overloved, overcompromised, just to feel chosen. You're grieving your own self-abandonment. But you need it too, because healing begins when illusion dies, the beginning of awakening. There's a moment, often quiet, often in the dark, when you realize they didn't reject you. They rejected the reflection you held up, the one that asked them to be real. And that hurts. It cuts deep, but it's also the start of something sacred, because you start asking new questions. What part of me allowed this? Why did I mistake their withdrawal for mystery? Why did I silence my needs to keep the peace? Why did I see their pain, but ignore my own? These aren't shameful questions. They are the gateway to liberation, because now finally, you're seeing yourself, not as the one who was abandoned, but as the one who is awakening. From abandonment to reclamation. Here's what no one teaches you. When someone walks away from you, you're not losing love, you're gaining clarity. When someone disconnects from you, you're not being rejected, you're being redirected. Back to yourself, back to your truth, back to your body, back to the part of you that no longer wants to settle for half-hearted love. This is your moment to stop apologizing for your depth, to stop shrinking for someone who was never present, to stop begging for reciprocity that should have been sacred. You are not hard to love. You are just finally realizing that love without presence is not love at all. The turning point. You're here now, in the quiet after the storm, in the stillness after they left, in the spacious ache of healing. And from this place, you get to choose to stop internalizing their absence as proof of your unworthiness, to stop revisiting a story that was never about your failure, to stop participating in a dynamic that starved your soul. You get to choose wholeness, and wholeness isn't loud. It's not dramatic. It doesn't need to chase or prove or plead. Wholeness just stands still and says, I am here, I am enough, I won't beg to be seen. And from that posture, everything changes. They didn't abandon you. They abandoned the version of themselves that could have met you there. But you're still here. And now, you're learning how to stop abandoning yourself. Truth that sets you free. There's a quiet revolution happening inside you now. It doesn't war. It doesn't rage. It doesn't demand revenge or final words. It simply begins. It begins with breath, with self-recognition, with that first moment where you no longer need them to validate what you already know. That love doesn't leave when it's real. That emotional absence is not your fault. That their inability to stay was never about your unworthiness, but about their own disconnection from truth. And that realization, it changes everything. The freedom in letting go of the fantasy. Letting go isn't about forgetting. It's about seeing clearly. It's about releasing the fantasy you once clung to like oxygen. Because fantasies keep us stuck. They keep us anchored to a version of someone that never really existed, except in our hopes, our projections, our desire to heal through love what was never healed in childhood. But clarity isn't cruel. Clarity is kind. Clarity is finally being able to say, they weren't a safe place. They were a pattern. And I've outgrown the need to stay where love is confused with sacrifice. Jung's mirror, wholeness as the goal. Carl Jung once said, I'd rather be whole than good. And that's what healing truly is. Not becoming perfect. Not becoming immune to hurt. Not becoming someone who never longs or aches or hopes. But someone who is whole. Whole enough to see clearly. Whole enough to feel deeply without collapsing. Whole enough to stay rooted in your own worth, no matter who walks away. Because when you're whole, you stop choosing people who only meet you halfway. You stop confusing emotional chaos with chemistry. You stop believing that suffering is proof of love. You start choosing peace, stability, depth, mutuality, and most of all, you start choosing yourself. You are no longer available for half love. There's a quiet power in the words. I am no longer available for anything that asks me to abandon myself. Because that sentence ends cycles. It breaks generational patterns. It redefines the terms of your existence. You begin seeing that you don't need to fix or rescue anyone to be worthy. That your softness isn't a flaw, it's a superpower. That being alone in truth is better than being entangled in confusion. That love should never require you to shrink. You start living from the inside out, no longer scanning for approval, no longer editing your expression for comfort, no longer mistaking silence for peace. Because now, you know, any love that demands your disappearance is not love. What happens when you stop chasing ghosts? Here's what begins to shift. When you stop chasing emotionally unavailable people, you reconnect with your body. You hear your intuition again. You feel the weight lifting not instantly, but unmistakably. You realize the peace wasn't in their return, it was in your release. You stop being magnetized to broken promises and start gravitating toward presence, toward people who actually show up, who hold eye contact, who call you back, who speak in actions, not excuses. You begin to understand what you craved wasn't them. It was safety, validation, belonging. And the more you heal, the more you realize you don't need to outsource those things anymore. You become them. Stop romanticizing emotional neglect. Let's be clear about something. Just because someone is emotionally complicated doesn't mean they're deep. Just because someone has trauma doesn't mean they're worthy of access to your heart. Compassion is beautiful, but when compassion turns into self-abandonment, it becomes self-harm. You can love people from afar. You can hold empathy without holding space for their chaos. You can wish them healing without making yourself their home. Because not everyone who comes into your life deserves to stay in your soul. You were never asking for too much. Here's the truth you needed all along. You weren't too intense. You weren't too sensitive. You weren't too deep. You were simply too awake. For someone still living asleep, you were asking for presence, consistency, emotional safety, clarity, partnership. Those aren't too much. Those are minimum requirements for any soul-centered connection. And if someone couldn't offer them, it's not your job to shrink. It's your invitation to rise. The new version of you. And so, from this moment forward, you begin choosing differently, not from fear, not from loneliness, not from the ache to be seen by someone else, but from wholeness. You begin saying no without guilt, trusting silence as an answer, leaving tables where love is conditional, walking away from emotional crumbs, believing that you are worthy of a love that stays. Because you are. You always were. You just needed the heartbreak to finally remember. They didn't abandon you. They abandoned the version of themselves that could have grown. They couldn't hold your truth because they hadn't met their own. But now, you get to meet yours. And that is where your life begins. If this message found you in the dark, if you've ever been left by someone who couldn't stay, if you're ready to stop abandoning yourself for people who ghost their own truth, leave a comment with, "I'm done shrinking." Let the world know you're reclaiming your worth. Subscribe if you want more Carl Jung-inspired psychology, self-healing, and deep emotional truth. Share this with someone who needs to hear that being left isn't the end. It's the beginning of wholeness. You are not broken. You are becoming. And the love you've been searching for starts inside you.